Boko Haram on the rampage earlier this year in northeast Nigeria. For the past week, the Islamist extremists have been terrorizing villages in Gwoza, near the Cameroonian border. There are reports of hundreds dead. Those that could headed to these Mandara mountains, Boko Haram fighters chasing and shooting them as they fled. I got through to a man who witnessed the recent attack on his village, Atagara. From the mountain, he told me homes were still on fire.
What happened to the dead people? Have they been buried?
Women, they go around with their hoe and dig the little grave, and then they just where the corpse is there, then push the corpse to the grave.
In shallow graves?
Yes.
Can you see any soldiers?
And we are expecting soldiers to come. Up to now, they didn't come.
Nigeria's military flying over the Sambisa forest, where Boko Haram has bases. It's where the more than 200 schoolgirls were initially taken after being abducted 8 weeks ago. This is what remains of their boarding school. The girls are still missing. But these days, Gwoza too has become a Boko Haram stronghold.
I am as worried as...
People from Gwoza get the latest information from their relatives back home in the villages that Boko Haram has been attacking.
A lot of black and white flags installed with Arabic writing on it, indicating that this is our headquarters and we are in control here. And other small villages, again, around have 1 or 2 flags flying. Yes, as of now, what they believe is that this place has been carved out of Nigeria.
The Nigerian military says it's doing its best, but the government doesn't want to say much about the deadly attacks on Gwoza.
Reports came in from sources that are speculative. I would not want to join it, but what I know is whatever is or should be done by the Nigerian military or the services, the police and so forth is being done. It's being done in this direction.
When President Goodluck Jonathan ordered the military offensive, he caused shock by revealing that parts of the northeast were no longer under the control of the state. A year on, and Boko Haram fighters are still holding territory in Nigeria as they continue their brutal campaign of violence. Will Ross, BBC News, Abuja.
Anti-Maidan, YouTube.
Получайте, ребятки, подарочки от ополчения Луганска. Суки.
The conflict in Ukraine has escalated. A man has been killed by an artillery shell fired from Ukraine across the border into Russia. Both sides had reported cross-border shootings, but this is the first time Moscow has reported a fatality on its side. In this note of protest, Russia said it was an aggressive act by the Ukrainian side against sovereign Russian territory. It warns of irreversible consequences. Ukraine denies firing across the border, suggesting separatist rebels provoking Moscow into action may have been to blame. But the rebels say it was not them. Meanwhile, in eastern Ukraine, thousands of families queued for hours for trains to safer regions of the country. They fear more violence as government forces head closer to Donetsk. The Ukrainian military say they have a plan to deliver a nasty surprise to the rebels.
Now in Iraq, radical Islamist militants linked to al-Qaeda are reportedly planning to take Baghdad after successfully advancing in the north. The so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria group has already captured the entire province of Nineveh, which you can see here, including its regional capital. The extremists then moved south and captured the cities of Baiji and Tikrit, and their advance was halted just 100 kilometres from Baghdad. It's thought the government's now asked the US to carry out drone strikes against the insurgents. But Marina Portnair explains now how that might mean Washington engaging against its own military hardware.
But we're leaving behind a sovereign, stable and self-reliant Iraq.
2.5 years later, the people America left behind are running away. fleeing for their lives.
Around 500,000 people have already escaped from Iraq's second city, Mosul, after the ISIL forced the army to retreat.
Reports say gunmen have also seized a nearby oil refinery town.
Iraq's Prime Minister calling for a state of emergency after hundreds of gunmen took control of strategic parts of the northern city of Mosul.
By Wednesday, militants had seized the Turkish consulate in Mosul, kidnapping the head of diplomatic mission and 24 staff members. Some 30,000 Iraqi soldiers reportedly turned and ran as militants from the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, known as ISIS, moved in, unleashing an all-out assault on the city.
They've taken control of hospitals, police stations. They have taken control of ammunition dumps and weapons stores that the fleeing government forces have left behind.
Many of the abandoned weapons and military hardware now in the hands of hardline terrorists were imported into Iraq from, guess where?
I think you all are aware of the shipments that we've provided that include the delivery of 300 Hellfire missiles, millions of rounds of small arms fire, thousands of rounds of tank ammunition, helicopter-fired rockets to the Iraqi security forces.
And don't forget about the U.S.-supplied Humvees. Here you can see ISIS insurgents riding and inspecting the vehicles, driving them across the border into war-torn Syria. Critics call it an unintended consequence of the U.S. war in Iraq coming home to roost.
There weren't any real sizable organized militant groups in Iraq until Al-Qaeda of the Mesopotamia arose to fight back at the U.S. invasion. To help the army, we've trained them for 8 years, and that didn't seem to work. Bush dismantled the original Iraqi army after the U.S. invasion, and that's the root of the problem.
The U.S. war in Iraq cost Washington close to $1 trillion and the lives of more than 4,500 soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have reportedly been killed while the U.S. was looking for WMDs and spreading democracy. The unified and competent Iraqi military that was allegedly established has buckled. Weapons that were made in the USA are now in the hands of America's enemies, and the country left to fend for itself in a state of crisis. Marina Portnaya, RT.
Well, at least 2 million people have been displaced by the violence, and there are also reports of mass beheadings being carried out by the extremists. Investigative journalist Robert Parry, who is a Middle East specialist, believes Iraq is collapsing and the US should take responsibility.
Well, it suggests that the Iraqi military is in decay, that it's beginning to collapse. Clearly, this is a very divided country. In terms of the question of stability or instability, the U.S. invasion in 2003 was the force that shattered this nation. And it's been hard to imagine how it was going to be put back together in any meaningful way since then. You had even someone like then Senator Joe Biden, now the vice president, suggesting some years ago that the country should be divided in three, that you should have a Sunni section, a Shiite section, and a Kurdish section. And it seems to be moving in that direction.
The monetary system of the world will collapse like a wet taco. A very fine analogy, sir.
Blood will run in the streets of Zurich. German bankers will just throw themselves under the trolley. Widows and orphans will be left penniless.
Sounds good to me.
There will be panic, there will be looting, rioting in the streets, and suicides.
Fabulous.